Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to start with some quick introductory slides. The panelists will then quickly introduce ourselves. We'll move into the panel questions, and then we will save at least 10 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. Thank you.
All right.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining today's session. My name's Simon Holt, and I'm the Head of Content Accessibility at the science publishers Elsevier. If we could move to the next slide, please. So, I think you moved too many. There we go. Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So we thought it'd be really helpful, just as a bit of scene setting and background, just to run through a few slides. Quite a lot of this stuff is stuff that I'm expecting quite a few people in this room will know already, but some of it may be stuff that you don't already know. And we thought before we got into the discussion, it would just be really good to make sure that we're all on the same page. So thinking about accessibility, who is it for, right? So apart from being a publisher, I am also a blind person. So accessibility is really important for me personally as well as professionally. Indeed, accessibility means that everybody has the opportunity to learn, gain knowledge, understand. And as publishers, as librarians, as researchers, this is what our mission is all about. And I think it's really important to think about in terms of what we do, in terms of impact. It helps all of the people on the screen, so not just people who are visually impaired, but people who are hearing impaired, people who might be dyslexic or dyspraxic, and actually a lot of people without disabilities as well. So I read something recently that said 70% of people under 30 accessed a video without sound at least once a week. Also, in terms of for discoverability, accessibility is really important because, for example, when you add image descriptions, sometimes known as alt text, to an image, you're turning a non-text asset into a text asset. That makes it more searchable and discoverable, and therefore you're increasing the value and impact of the content that we publish. So therefore, accessibility is for everybody. Next slide, please. So you may be familiar with the two new major accessibility laws that have come to pass in the past couple of years. So in Europe, we had the European Accessibility Act that came into force in June this year and talks about e-books and e-commerce solutions in the EU. And then in April, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act that is much broader, that covers any web content. So that also includes journals, for example. Both are based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So if you're conformant with one, then you're also conformant with the other. It's just the ADA has a much bigger scale. Next slide, please. And why is this important? Why is it happening? It's to allow people with disabilities to become what we call independent economic operators. So meaning that if you have a disability, you're able to purchase, access, download, read content in the same way as everybody else. This is huge in terms of equity, in terms of learning, in terms of understanding. It's really important to think about that when we're thinking about the changes that we're making as a community, as an industry, to ensure that everybody is able to access the content that we publish. Because at the end of the day, it's all right talking about, for example, open access, but if something isn't accessible, if people can't use it, it's not really doing the job, let's be honest. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just mention, given that we're at, obviously, the Charleston Library Conference, the work of the Library Accessibility Alliance. And I've included a link here, and I definitely recommend that you check it out. So this can be found on the Library Accessibility Alliance website. And so the Library Accessibility Alliance is a group of consortia who've come together to advocate and campaign for accessibility and have set out a framework about how they expect their partners, so publishers, vendors, etc., to act to conform with the new Americans with Disabilities Act legislation. And as you can see, there is various things that they recommend. So I would say here prioritization is really important, starting off with the content that most people use. Having an accessibility contact is really important. So then students, researchers can have a conversation to say, I need this, how can we work together? And also thinking about what to do with legacy content as well, I think is really important here too. Next slide, please. So in terms of what the differences are between the two pieces of legislation, I think the main thing that I wanted to talk about here is just to highlight the scope of the ADA is much broader. So it includes anything on the web, so that's journals, online platforms, etc. And also that the burden of responsibility legally lies with public institutions, so universities, etc., etc. That's quite different to the EAA, where the burden of responsibility basically lies with the publisher. So what this means is, in practice is, whilst the EAA is primarily a government-driven operation, the ADA, I think, will be enforced more from a civil point of view, where you will get students complaining to universities, to hospitals, etc., and the universities will then say to the publisher, well, we get your content from you, how are you providing us with accessible content? So the point is we all need to work together to make sure that the content that we're all using and licensing is accessible. Next slide, please. So finally, what are the suggested next steps here, right? So prioritize these different categories of images, of content here. Images, video, metadata is extremely important so people know exactly the accessibility features of what they're buying or downloading, so people don't end up spending money and time on content they then can't access. Think about accessible file formats, especially EPUB, which is the most accessible file format. Prioritize content, as I mentioned, and also really prioritize transparency. So I've talked about accessibility statements on websites here. Publish a roadmap as much as you can so people know what to expect from the future, and have a point of contact, because at the end of the day, solutions to accessibility challenges tend to be sometimes quite complicated, and they merit a conversation, and they can be different for each individual. So therefore, have an avenue where a conversation is possible and we can help give everybody what they need. I'm now going to turn back over to Dana, who is going to facilitate the conversation that we're now going to have between ourselves and also, obviously, most importantly, with you guys as well.
Thank you, Simon. So we'll just start with our introductions. My name is Dana Timmons. I am a medical librarian at Methodist University, Cape Fear Valley Health School of Medicine. I just started there in September of this year, and prior to that, I was at Xavier University of Louisiana as a health sciences librarian. Both institutions are smaller, private institutions.
I'm Catherine Klosek. I lead information policy and advocacy for ARL, the Association of Research Libraries, and I staff our advocacy and public policy committee. So our information policy priorities include accessibility for people with disabilities, copyright policy, and online speech. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap between those topics, and I'll leave it there for now.
I'm Judy Russell. I am now the former Dean of University Libraries for the University of Florida. I was the Dean for 18 years. UF, for those of you who don't know, is a large R1 public university. I stepped down in July and I'm on a research year, and accessibility is one of my research commitments. I have had a long-term interest in and concern about accessibility, but one thing that substantially strengthened that was more than 20 years ago, hearing the provost or president of Gallaudet University speak, and he made the comment that we are all only temporarily abled. And if you think about accessibility from that point of view of at what point is it not just people you serve or family member or friends who may need accessible content, but at what point might you yourself need it? And we prepare for that by producing accessible content. Simon?
Hi, everybody. So as I mentioned, I'm Head of Content Accessibility at the science publisher Elsevier. I'm also a visually impaired person myself, and throughout my career, I have campaigned for greater disability inclusion within the publishing industry, whether that's the organisations that we work at or the content that we publish. One of the things that I feel really strongly is that the solutions for accessibility are ones that we form together. And to that end, for the past year, it's been my pleasure to have formed and to run a library accessibility advisory board, including these three fine individuals and several others as well, because I believe that it's only by talking about and shaping together the solutions that we're going to be able to move forward. I'm currently looking to expand that, so if anybody is interested, if you're a librarian and you're interested in becoming a member of the Library Accessibility Advisory Board, then please come and find me after the conference, after the session today, and I'd be delighted to talk about that a little bit further. Dana, back over to you.
All right, thank you all. So our first question for the panel is, where does responsibility lie for making content more accessible, and what roles can libraries, publishers, authors, and readers play?
Great. I'll kick us off. Thank you for that question. So, legally and technically under the ADA, we just heard from Simon that the, responsibility is on the state and local government entity. So for our intents and purposes, we're talking about the institution of higher education. But I think we can all agree that really accessibility is everyone's responsibility, and I think we'll hear more about that from Judy and others as well. I'll share that one of the primary ways that ARL has been engaging in the ADA Title II regulations is really around advocacy, and so we submitted comments to the Department of Justice to kind of shape and inform the regulations. And one thing we lifted up were all the ways that libraries are prioritizing accessibility already. We talked a lot about how, incentives to produce born accessible content or content that's accessible, to begin with, especially digital content, will be a really efficient and effective way to meet the needs of students and faculty and others that have disabilities so that they can access course materials and research materials at the same time as their peers. And the DOJ actually seemed to kind of pick up those comments and reflect them back in the final rule. They said that they think that the new regulation will lead institutions to demand. It'll increase the demand among institutions for born accessible materials and eventually lead, vendors and publishers to produce more born accessible materials. And that's great, but we know that's not just going to happen. And so we've been doing a lot of, ARL and our members have been doing a lot of work with publishers and conversations like these in the advisory board that Simon mentioned to really share our understanding of the requirements and to work toward meeting them together. So legally and technically, we have that legal responsibility, but again, it is very much a shared responsibility.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that briefly. I think it's about what role do we play and what role can we play as well. So I think each of us, so publishers, libraries, authors, readers, all have different roles to play, right? So for example, if we think about image descriptions or alt text, right? A lot of people have said, authors are the experts, they should write the alt text. I'm personally not a big fan of that because I think this is technical writing and very different from writing a scientific paper, for example. I actually think this is a value add for the publisher, and I think the author's responsibility there is to check and review the alt text content for completeness, accuracy, and relevancy. I think the reader's role here is to identify issues and to flag up where things go wrong. I think the publisher's role is to make sure that accessibility and born accessible content is embedded into all of the workflows, and that accessibility features like alt text and like video content and metadata are supplied properly. And I think libraries' role is to make sure that that is all organized properly so that everybody, the reader, is then clear when they're accessing the library exactly how it works. So I think it's everybody's responsibility, but we don't all have the same responsibility. Our roles are all quite different because we all have different strengths. And so when I come back to this being a team effort, that's exactly what I mean.
And I think you all probably agree with us that it is a shared responsibility, and we all need to be advocates within our own organizations and advocates with the others that we interact with. I'll summarize some of the roles that I've seen at our university. License negotiations have been really critical with publishers of reinforcing to them our expectations for accessible content, but then recognizing that we can't be asking publishers to do what we're unwilling to do ourselves. We have a small library press at UF, which does mostly open access content. And so we have now developed much stronger practices for screening everything we have before we put it up, because we had thought we were being very accessible. And when we started testing, we realized we might have been 90% of the way there, but we weren't 100% of the way there. I think, pardon?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
But also, there's roles for leadership on campus. There's certainly especially roles for content that the libraries themselves produce, LibGuides and websites and any other kinds of training and instructional materials that we do. I do want to follow up on some of the earlier statements that content is not open. We say we're producing, and our publishers say they're producing a lot of open access content, but it is not open access if it's not accessible. And I have long advocated that we at least stop making the problem worse, stop making a bigger hole that we have to dig ourselves out of. And so I think that's an important part of this, of getting to the point where we're producing accessible content. We know we're going to have a huge and expensive process to go back on retrospective content. That's going to be a challenge for all of us. As small as our library press is, we've been working on that, going back for our limited range of titles. But I think our highest priority has to be to stop producing content that's not accessible so that we don't continually create more content that we're going to later have to remediate.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the second question now. How will libraries and end users know the content they are licensing is compliant?
Okay, I'll have a first go at that. Metadata is really important, right? If you take one thing away from today's session, make it that the metadata for your books, so using Onyx, and your journals using the NISO standard, is really important, not only for the end user, so they know what accessibility features an individual title or an individual journal has, but also in terms of compliance and licensing, because I think it's entirely reasonable that libraries know, for example, what it is that they're licensing here. So I think you've got metadata, you also have various born accessible accreditations. So I'm going to talk about, for example, I would highlight the Benetech got a globally certified accessible accreditation that publishers can get for their content. This is quite a difficult accreditation to get. It took Elsevier about 2 years to go through the process. But what it means is that if you see a publisher has something like that, you know the content that they're licensing meets the required standards. I think it's, what I would say is, it is reasonable to make sure that publishers are supplying you with the right paperwork. Clearly, the paperwork for a book is not going to be the same as paperwork for a whole platform. So you're not going to get a VPAT for an individual title. That's not reasonable because it takes about a month to manually come up with that kind of thing. But I think making sure that when you're licensing content, that it comes with the right metadata and you are getting some kind of authorization from the publisher that they are conforming with the standards by looking at their accessibility statements and their accessibility policies, I think is really important. So you guys have that reassurance.
Thanks. And I just wanted to add a couple of resources. So we mentioned the Library Accessibility Alliance. So you might be familiar with their testing and evaluation service. Okay, heads are nodding, so that's good. But that's available, that's for everybody, libraries and publishers. They do that testing and they share the results. In addition to the Benetech certification that Simon mentioned, we wanted to make sure that folks know about the Accessible Books Consortium charter for accessible publishing. Have folks heard about that? I'm just curious. Or the Benetech thing. Okay, give it a Google. Or come out to us after, and we can help you learn more about that. But just wanted to mention those 2 additional resources.
Thank you. So our third question, how can we best use our existing resources and technology collectively to make new and previously published content more accessible for individuals with disabilities?
Yeah, I think I can take a go at this. I think, look, there's lots and lots of different technology out there and things are improving all the time. If I look at the work, for example, that the PDF Association are doing to make PDFs more accessible, I think that's really exciting. Clearly, AI is on everybody's minds, and I think it's really important that we think carefully how we're using AI. I think AI has massive potential, really to transform the accessibility landscape at scale in terms of things like generating alt text descriptions, in terms of video captions, automated metadata validation, etc. However, clearly there's going to be a proceed with caution kind of thing as well, right? So, we talked about lessons learned from the EAA, and one of the things that we've learned is AI is improving a lot, and it can add quite good alt text descriptions now, for example, for simple images like photographs, for some more basic charts and graphs, but it's not good enough yet for, these kind of very complex multi-panel images. So it's going to be really important to think about how you can integrate human beings into the process as well. And I think certainly when we're thinking about accessibility at scale, I think there's going to be continued experimentation. So I think Ohio State University and Arizona State University are doing a pilot at the moment around AI automated accessibility for what's going into their repository, and that's really interesting. Whether that's at the right quality yet for kind of mass scale and production quality, I'm not sure, but I think my feeling is always the comparison is not between the ideal and, not bad. The comparison is between nothing and quite good. So I think we must experiment, we must explore, we must be bold, but I think we must be cautiously bold, because obviously from an existential point of view, it's very important from a library point of view and from a publisher point of view that readers fundamentally trust that what is in those books and journals is true, accurate, and complete. And therefore, we can't really be messing about with this stuff. So I would say try things, pilot, experiment, iterate, but know this is a work in progress.
And I'll just say, as I had said in the introduction, that I'm coming from smaller libraries. So speaking from that perspective, this can feel overwhelming, or also like, oh no, we're so far behind. We're nowhere near the formal plans of the larger universities or that level of knowledge, or have AI like that to work with. But we can start out small. At Xavier, we had one person who was really focused on the LibGuides. And so she was one of the reference librarians. She took that up, made sure they're more accessible, and it is checking them. She owned that project, she applied for a grant, and has done continuing education to learn more about it. At Methodist, the inaugural medical school class will start in January 2026. So I'm building the collection with accessibility in mind, working on our policies. And there's a lot of stuff that I've learned from this board too, as far as like metadata that I just wasn't thinking of before. And so for everyone, but also if you're in, that smaller situation, I'd really say reach out to your networks. We have all these experts right here, so many other people at the conference, who I'm sure have a ton of resources and tips and are happy to share them with us. And my big thing I would say is just don't be afraid to ask questions or admit this is new to me, or, I need help.
This is less about technology and more about resources, but we've talked a little bit about negotiating and licensing e-resources as an opportunity for libraries and publishers to work together and to talk about sort of shared expectations. And so I just wanted to mention a book that ARL published earlier this year. It's called E-Resource Licensing Explained. It's written by and for licensing librarians, and there's a chapter on accessibility, and it just has great language and strategies that you might want to put into practice. And, vendors, publishers, take a look as well and sort of see the way that libraries are thinking about this. It has some really solid examples, and I could say a lot more about it, but I'll keep it at that for now.
So I would hope that one of your takeaways from this is looking at your own roles in whatever institution you're in or consortia you participate in or whatever publishing you do. But I think it's very important that we acknowledge that it requires leadership from the publishers, from the libraries, in organizations of all types and sizes that produce content. We've got to prioritize accessibility and allocate resources, even in times like we're experiencing at UF right now with significant budget challenges, not because it's a legal obligation, although that certainly helps with motivating our supporting organizations to help us do it, because of their concern about the possible consequences of failure to comply, but because it's the right thing to do. And most of us have been working on accessibility for a very long time before this legislation was in place. But now I think we feel, rather than frustrated or challenged by it, it can help support us in moving this forward.
All right, so question 4 is, what community initiatives exist to aid knowledge sharing?
I just wanted to highlight, if I don't know if folks have seen this toolkit by ALA, but it's ala.org/accessibility. That's been a culmination of community work of all kinds of libraries. I've been working with them on that as well, and it includes resources from all over, and it's a really great toolkit to if you're thinking about wherever you are in your ADA journey. I think it can be really useful. So I just wanted to encourage you all to check that out. And I also wanted to mention again, we've been having these conversations as the Elsevier Library Accessibility Advisory Board, but also here at Charleston. We started doing a little lunch together with vendors and publishers and libraries, and I think we've all gotten a lot out of that, both learned from one another and learned who to go to and rely on when we have particular questions as well. So just wanted to highlight those examples.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple of others as well. So this also, I guess, relates to the tools question. If you don't know about the DAISY Consortium, then I definitely recommend you check it out. They are the standards body for accessibility, and they have something called a inclusive publishing knowledge hub that I really cannot recommend highly enough. That's free and anybody can access it. They also have various free tools like something called ACE, which is an EPUB validation checker, and we use it in the production of all our EPUBs. So I massively recommend checking out DAISY for some very useful and most importantly free tools. The other community I would mention is the Publishing Accessibility the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, PAAG, which is based out of the UK, but it's international, includes a lot of US members as well, and that is a mailing list and a bi-monthly call that you can join, where basically you get people at different publishers, different libraries, different institutions talking about challenges with accessibility that they're having and how to solve these together, right? I think one thing I'd really like to say is nobody has monopoly on answers here, and nobody has all the solutions, right? None of us and nobody else is turning up saying, oh, we've got all the answers. And if anybody tells you you've got all the answers, then trust me, don't believe them, because this is complicated stuff, right? But we have to work together. And I think community initiatives like the guidelines Catherine talked about, like the groups that I've talked about, like the DAISY Consortium in terms of standards and guidelines, mean that we can all work together to iterate and develop those solutions collectively as a community.
All right, thanks everyone. So now we have time for questions from the audience. We have a volunteer here, so we just ask that you speak into the microphone so we can record it. And please state your name, your institution, and your question.
Hi, I'm Allison Beelan at Duke University Press, and I really appreciate all the perspectives here. And we're in renewal season, so we are fielding a lot of questions from our library partners about where we are in accessibility. And, you know, I appreciated the ethos of this panel of like, hey, we're all figuring there's a mountain of work to do. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of resources. You know, don't get overwhelmed. How would you advise a publisher balance that with some of the licensing language we're being presented with? And, you know, we look at licenses as contracts that we hope to fulfill, and the language can be very black and white about what is expected. And so how do we balance that with this? Yes, we all know this is going to take probably longer than April 2026.
Can I just real quick, and then I'm
You
sure
go first,
much
and
to
then
say. Just a little piece of this. One thing I've seen libraries using in their licensing strategies is, okay, if if a vendor can't warrant that a material is accessible immediately, to have like a roadmap or a timeline. And I think that's been, pretty successful. So it's less like, black and white. So that's one thing that is seemed to work pretty well. That can serve as something that the library can rely on, can communicate to their, patrons and so on, and gives you something mutual to work toward together.
Yeah, I'd really echo that, and I go back to something that Judy said before. Prioritize your front list content, stop making the situation worse, and then see how things can be phased going forward, starting with your most highly used content. I think is the way forward, and have an accessibility statement, and also look at, by having a point of contact, how you can help the people who are asking for help. So for example, there's organizations like the Access Text Network that you can be involved in that will help provide accessible files to the people that need them for backlist books, for example, right? So I think one step at a time is what I would say. Doing something is always better than doing nothing. And like with every other business decision and business priority, this is something that needs phasing according to resource. The main thing that I would say is to echo what Catherine said in terms of transparency is really important. So you explain what you've done, what you can't do. And I think for us, for example, this may help. We have 3 categories of content that we talk about. We've got the stuff that we've already done or are doing from the off. So that's, for us, that's all new content and the past 5 years of backlist. We then have the stuff that's available on demand. So we have an on-demand system and process for any legacy content older than 5 years. And then we have the stuff that falls under the undue burden category, which is stuff that we won't be remediating. So that's stuff where for example, we don't have the original files because it's something very old. So a scanned PDF from the 80s or something that would be extremely expensive to remediate, maybe from a pre-XML era, or something, for example, where changing the nature by making the book accessible would change its fundamental nature. So, for example, we publish coloring books, for example, right? Making an accessible version of that, not really possible, okay? So thinking about those 3 categories has helped us really understand what we're doing now, what's going on a roadmap, and what's going to be on demand, and actually, realistically, what's not going to happen, and crucially, documenting why.
And if I could add, and I think it's true for commercial publishers, it's certainly true for us at UF, and therefore I assume for some of you, focus on what you can control. And I'll give you an example of something that we have difficulty controlling, and I think Simon might also say that some of the publishers have difficulty controlling. We sponsor over 20 open access journals, and by sponsor, it's simply that we authorize them to be hosted on the Open Journal software that is our Service Bureau of Florida Virtual Campus hosts for all of the state university system. We don't control those journals. They don't come through us for any editorial review. We've done training for the editors, encouraging them to tell their authors what their authors need to be doing, but we don't have control over that content. We don't have editorial responsibility directly for it. I know, Simon, you've mentioned things like where you have society publishers and maybe they send camera-ready copy, or even if they send electronic copy, you don't really have the ability to do the editing and changing. So I think that's part of that prioritizing. Focus on what you can do and get done as much of that as you can, but watch for those other things and see what you can do to remediate it. That we've stepped up the training of the editors of these open access journals, knowing that ultimately they're going to have to take responsibility for working with their authors to be sure their journal is accessible.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so we can take another question up here.
Hi, I'm Emily Menzel at Duke University's Law Library. And you've highlighted the value of metadata here, and I wondered if you could go into some more specifics about what you mean by that, particularly when the metadata is being, or both when and by whom the metadata is being created, where it's being stored, where it's being displayed, things like, is this an overall WCAG rating? Is this, like, what types of metadata?
Let me make one comment. I think Simon probably has more substantive answer, but I think what users need is consistent location of the information and also terminology so they can readily identify what the capability of the content they're trying to access is. And so getting those kind of standards in place. I recently purchased a Kindle book, and this page immediately after the title page listed what the accessibility features were of that file. I've not seen that in any other Kindle book. I don't know if it was that publisher, that author, or whether we're now going to start seeing this from the Kindle folks. But again, it was just a surprise to me, but there's the statement saying you can, with this Kindle book, access in all of these different ways. So, but I do think part of it is that consistency, so that if I'm looking, I know how to find things that will be accessible, and I know how to understand what I'm being told about what parts of the accessibility are and are not available. But Simon, you may have more substantive way to address that.
I'll do my best. So for going back to something I said earlier about how different parts of the process have different roles, right? So as a publisher, I see that the publisher's role is to make sure that for books, we're using the Onyx framework, so list 196, and I think there's 3 other lists as well, that have that contain accessibility fields that talk about, you know, whether it has a reading order, a table of contents, do the alt text have, do the images have alt text? Is it WCAG 2.1 compliant? Are there any hazards? What about video content? Or, you know, it goes, there's about 57 different fields, I think it is, right? For journals, there doesn't seem to be a established industry standard. We are using a NISO standard, which is the best that we've come up with so far to display similar information. And that is created by our suppliers and vetted using our automated tools, validated using our automated tools, and displayed on all of the platforms on which we publish and sent to all our third-party providers. It's also, you know, your Amazons and what have you, right? It's also supplied to libraries. And one of the challenges that I found, and Dana, maybe you might want to talk to this in a minute, is not all libraries seem to be set up to receive and display all metadata. And I think this is a challenge, right? And so when I say we all have different responsibilities, I think it's the publisher's responsibility to make sure we're providing the metadata and we're sending it to the right place. I think it's the library's responsibility to make sure that they are able to display the metadata. And I think one thing we can all work on together is maybe providing a bit more consistency in those instances. So, you know, if you're, for example, ingesting Onyx 2 at the moment, then please upgrade to Onyx 3, that kind of thing. Dana, I don't know if you had anything to add about the stuff you've been talking to me about in terms of kind of libraries' ability or not to receive some of this metadata.
I don't really, because I don't deal with it that much, but
Yeah.
it being just me, and
Yeah.
there's a lot to learn. But so, yeah, I couldn't really speak to that too well.
I think it's also the intermediate platforms, and when we're talking specifically about metadata, I learned several years ago that when I'm going to WorldCat, I'm not seeing the full metadata, the full cataloging record that OCLC has, that they're putting out for the purposes of WorldCat, selected metadata. So going to that type of platform, but also just intermediate platforms who are taking publisher content and having those dialogues with them about what are they putting out. I mean, I think it's really, really important that people should be easily able to seek and identify accessible content relative to their needs. And if we're not carrying those fields, as you said, in our own online catalogs, but also in these intermediary platforms, we're not making that very easy for the users.